You ever realize someone thinks they own your land before you've even finished unpacking? The first thing I heard on my first morning at the cabin wasn't birds. It wasn't wind through pine trees. It was the sharp metallic crack of a post driver echoing across the ridge like somebody hammering ownership into the dirt. I was still standing in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee I hadn't taken a sip from when I looked out the window and saw three men in bright safety vests driving stakes into the ground 30 feet from my front porch. Fresh lumber stacked beside a trailer. Orange survey flags fluttering in the mountain air. And standing in the middle of it all with sunglasses and a clipboard was a woman who looked way too comfortable on my property. I stepped outside. The morning air smelled like wet cedar and cold stone. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked downhill. Nobody acknowledged me. One guy kept measuring. Another started unloading picnic tables. The woman glanced over once, smiled like she was greeting hotel staff, then looked away. "Morning," I said. She turned slowly. White tennis jacket. Perfect blonde hair that somehow survived mountain humidity. Expression calm enough to make my stomach tighten. "Good," she said. "You're up." Not hello. Not welcome to the neighborhood. "You're up." She tapped her clipboard. "Rebecca Whitmore, HOA president." Then she pointed behind me. "We need access to this section of land immediately." I looked around. "Access for what?" She said it casually, like explaining recycling pickup. "Community expansion project. Picnic area. Observation deck. Small fire pit. Residents approved it 6 months ago." I waited. She expected something. Realization maybe. Compliance. Instead I said, "This is my cabin." She smiled wider. Not embarrassed. Not confused. Patient. Like she'd heard that before. "The structure is yours." She pointed at the slope beside it. "The surrounding land isn't." One of the workers started setting another stake into the ground. Clang, clang, clang. Rebecca opened a folder and pulled out a document with colored maps and highlighted sections. She held it toward me, but didn't let go. Standard HOA community. Easement. Previous ownership situation. Happens all the time. I didn't take the paper. I just looked at the map. My driveway. My front yard. Half the tree line behind the cabin. Yellow marker over all of it. She lowered her voice like she was helping me avoid embarrassment. "Look, Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell. I know moving is stressful, but we've already invested money into this. So if we can avoid legal complications," she let the sentence hang. I looked past her at the workers. One had started spray painting lines directly across the edge of my property. Then I looked back at Rebecca. She gave me that practiced neighborhood smile people use when they've already decided they're right. I nodded once. "Got it." Her expression shifted for half a second, like she expected resistance and didn't know what to do with agreement. I turned around and walked back toward the cabin. Behind me, I heard her call out, cheerful now, "Welcome to the community." I opened my front door, set my untouched coffee down, pulled a thin folder out of the moving box labeled closing documents. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened to the last page. I sat there for a full minute without turning the page. Not because I was surprised, because I recognized the feeling. The same feeling you get when someone confidently explains rules to you before realizing they skipped the only page that matters. Outside, I could still hear the rhythm of construction. Hammer, metal, reverse alarms from a utility cart. Somebody laughed. Somebody else dragged lumber across gravel. It sounded less like a project and more like people settling into ownership they thought nobody would question. The folder smelled faintly like old paper and fresh printer ink. Closing documents. Transfer agreement. Survey packet. Nothing dramatic. No giant red stamp saying secret owner. Just normal paperwork. That was usually how the important things worked. Quiet. I closed the folder and leaned back in the kitchen chair. Through the window, I could see the cabin deck stretching toward the trees. 40 years old if the inspection report was accurate. Cedar siding faded silver. Stone chimney. 1 acre around the structure. Officially deeded with residential access rights. Most people stop reading there. Most people never ask why a cabin that size in a private mountain community sold for less than a downtown condo. I asked. The answer was on page 43. I bought this place 3 weeks earlier. Not because I needed a mountain escape. Not because I suddenly wanted to become one of those people who stack firewood for fun and post pictures of coffee mugs online. I bought it because of the seller. His name was Walter Bishop, 81 years old. No children. No grandkids. Lived alone for years. When I toured the property, He walked slower than the tour itself, but remembered every square foot of land. At one point, he stopped at the porch railing and asked me a question. You ever own something everybody uses, but nobody remembers belongs to somebody? I thought he meant getting old. Turns out he meant paperwork. Walter never talked badly about the HOA. That was the strange part. He never complained. Never warned me. Just smiled every time the neighborhood came up. Before closing, he handed me a small envelope and said, "Read this after you move in." Inside was one sentence written in block letters. Do not show them anything until they ask for it. I remember laughing at the time. Thought it was old man humor. Standing in that kitchen now, listening to people mark lines across my yard, it suddenly felt less funny. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Female voice. Cheerful. Professional. Hello, Mr. Caldwell. This is Melissa from the HOA office. Rebecca asked me to remind you that construction crews will remain on site until 6 this evening and temporary access restrictions begin tomorrow. I looked outside. One worker had already placed a sign near the trail. Community space coming soon. I smiled and said, "Thanks for letting me know." She paused, probably expecting an argument. That is all. I looked at the folder again. Closed it. For now. Then I hung up and reached for Walter's envelope one more time. The next morning smelled like fresh-cut lumber and expensive assumptions. I opened the cabin door and stopped. Overnight, somebody had added rope barriers along the side of my yard. Not temporary construction tape. Actual braided decorative rope tied between polished cedar posts like they had been there for years. There was even a small wooden sign planted beside my driveway. Future Ridgeview Community Overlook. Estimated completion, 14 days. Underneath, in smaller letters, thank you for supporting neighborhood improvements. I stood there holding my coffee while mountain fog drifted between the trees. Nobody had asked. Nobody had emailed. They had skipped permission and moved directly into celebration. I walked down the slope again. Rebecca was already there. Different outfit. Same energy. This time she had 4 residents with her. Folding chairs. Pastries. Stainless steel coffee urn. They were having what looked suspiciously like a planning meeting on land they had informed me yesterday was not mine. Rebecca noticed me immediately and raised a hand like she owned the sunrise. Ethan. Perfect timing. She turned to the group. Everyone, this is our new cabin resident. Not owner. Resident. A man in his 60s wearing a quarter-zip sweater smiled politely. Glad to have somebody finally using that place. Rebecca stepped beside me and lowered her voice. We are introducing the project today. Community morale has been low. I looked around. One woman was taking photos of the view. Another was sketching where benches would go. Somebody had already brought flower samples. Rebecca handed me a printed packet. Community Integration Agreement. I flipped through it. Volunteer Contribution Recommendations. Maintenance Participation. Shared Land Understanding. Signature line. She smiled. Just standard onboarding. I looked up. For what? She blinked once. For community participation. I nodded slowly and closed the packet. Interesting. She gave a small laugh. You seem calm. One of the residents joined in. Most people fight at first. Rebecca smiled again. There it was. That sentence. At first. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. Pattern. They had done this before. I asked, how long has this overlook project been planned? Rebecca answered instantly. Almost a year. The older man beside her frowned slightly. No, I thought this started after winter. Rebecca ignored him. I kept my expression flat. And the previous owner agreed? Her smile sharpened. He understood community priorities. Not yes. Understood. I noticed something then. Nobody else looked comfortable. They looked excited. Not guilty. Like they genuinely believed this was normal. That changed something for me. This was not a villain with henchmen. This was a person who had been narrating reality long enough that people stopped checking. Rebecca reached for the packet again and tapped the signature line. If you sign today, we can waive the first assessment fee. I folded the packet neatly and handed it back. I do not sign documents on my second day somewhere. She smiled, but her eyes cooled a few degrees. That attitude usually creates unnecessary complications. I looked past her toward the overlook sign, then back at her. Good to know. Then I turned around and walked toward the cabin again. Halfway up the path, I heard her call out behind me in that same cheerful voice. Do not worry. You will understand how things work around here soon enough. I smiled without turning around because for the first time since moving in, I was starting to think she might be right. By the third morning, I had learned something about mountain silence. It only feels peaceful until somebody starts organizing it. I woke up before sunrise because of a low electric hum outside the bedroom window. Not construction this time. Different sound. Controlled. Intentional. I pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped onto the deck. The air was cold enough to sting my nose. Pine, damp earth, distant chimney smoke. And running across the edge of my yard were temporary string lights. White bulbs. Extension cords. Little wooden stakes. Somebody had transformed part of the slope into what looked like an event setup. A laminated sign stood near the tree line. Community Sunset Social Friday 6:30 p.m. RSVP required. I stared at it for a few seconds before laughing once under my breath. Nobody had asked. Again, my phone buzzed almost immediately. Email. Subject line, welcome event participation instructions. Sender, Ridgeview HOA. Inside was a cheerful message thanking me for allowing community access and reminding me to clear personal items from designated gathering areas. Attached was a map. My porch was highlighted. I made coffee and sat outside watching people work. Around 8, a couple walked up carrying folding chairs. Mid-50s. Friendly faces. They stopped when they saw me. The husband smiled awkwardly. Morning. We figured you would not mind us setting these near your deck. I looked at him. Why would I mind? His smile faded slightly. His wife answered before he could. Rebecca said you already approved everything. There it was again. Not force. Narrative. Somebody else speaks first long enough, and eventually people stop asking questions. I smiled. Interesting. They looked uncomfortable and carried the chairs somewhere else. Around noon, Rebecca arrived in a golf cart with a clipboard balanced on her lap, like a ceremonial object. She parked, stepped out, and looked around approvingly. This is coming together nicely. I asked, how many people are coming? She answered without hesitation. Probably 60. 60. I nodded. That seems like a lot for somebody else's yard. She smiled immediately. Too quickly. Shared space creates community. Then she handed me another document. Event acknowledgement form. I skimmed it. Temporary occupancy. Noise exception. Liability language. Signature line. Again. I handed it back. I am going to pass. She did not move. Her smile stayed in place, but became smaller somehow. You keep saying no without actually objecting. I looked at her. Do I need to object? She folded her arms. People here participate. I nodded. People here also assume things. Her eyes narrowed for the first time. Tiny movement. Barely visible. She took one slow breath and switched tones completely. No smile. No friendliness. Mr. Caldwell, this community has operated successfully for over 20 years. We are not going to change procedures because somebody bought a cabin and wants privacy. I looked past her at the lights. The chairs. The overlook sign. Then back at her. How many owners approve this? She answered immediately. Enough. Not a number. Just confidence. I smiled once and said, that is usually not the answer people give when they know. For the first time since I arrived, she did not respond right away. She stared at me for a second too long, gave a polite nod, got back into her cart, and drove away. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, I walked back inside and opened Walter's envelope again. This time I noticed something I had missed before. There was writing on the back. The back of the envelope had only 8 words written in blue ink. Wait until they tell you what they own. That was it. No explanation. No dramatic reveal. Just one sentence in handwriting so steady it looked measured with a ruler. I turned the envelope over twice like more words might appear if I looked hard enough. Outside, somebody tested the string lights. Warm white bulbs flickered across the trees. My yard looked less like a mountain cabin and more like a venue that forgot to invite the owner. Friday came cold and bright. By noon, cars started arriving. Not dozens. Just a steady stream. SUVs. Crossovers. People carrying folding chairs, casserole dishes, coolers. Nobody looked sneaky. Nobody looked guilty. Most smiled and waved. A few introduced themselves. Glad somebody finally bought Walter's place. Rebecca said you wanted to get involved. This overlook idea has been years in the making. Every sentence landed the same way. Rebecca had not taken permission. She had taken authorship. Around 5:30, I walked down toward the setup. String lights overhead. Small speaker playing acoustic music. Folding tables lined along the edge of the slope. Somebody had hung a welcome banner between 2 trees. Welcome to Ridgeview. Rebecca stood near the center greeting people like she was opening a resort. When she saw me, she smiled instantly and raised her cup. There he is. Conversations softened around us. Not silence, just attention. Rebecca stepped closer and lowered her voice enough to sound personal while making sure everyone nearby could hear. I was beginning to think you were skipping your own welcome event. I looked around. Looks like you had it covered. She laughed. A few people laughed too. Then she held out a clipboard. One small thing. Before we officially start. Signature page. Event acknowledgement again. But this version had more language. Temporary use acceptance. Shared maintenance recognition. Community land access understanding. I read the first page slowly. Rebecca waited. People watched. Somebody adjusted a camera tripod near the food table. She smiled and said quietly, "It just helps avoid confusion later." I looked up. Confusion about what? Her smile did not move. About expectations. I nodded and handed the clipboard back and signed. Her face stayed pleasant, but something tightened around her eyes. "You seem hesitant to participate." I looked around again. Sunset hitting the ridge. Kids running near the trees. People talking. Normal people. Nobody here looked malicious. They looked convinced. That was the dangerous part. I said, "I just like understanding agreements before I join them." Rebecca smiled wider. "That mindset works in cities. Communities require trust." Then she turned to the crowd and clapped once. "Before dinner, quick announcement." Everybody looked over. She stood under the lights holding the clipboard against her chest. "As everyone knows, we finally have movement on expanding the overlook area." People nodded. She gestured toward my cabin. "And our newest resident has been very cooperative during the transition process." I stood still. A few people smiled at me. One woman even thanked me. Rebecca continued, "We expect formal alignment soon and construction can move into phase 2. Applause. Small but real. I looked at Rebecca. She looked back and smiled. Not challenging me. Counting on me. Then she said one sentence quietly enough that only I heard it. "People do not move up here to start fights." I smiled and looked at the clipboard in her hand. Good thing. Then I picked up a cookie, thanked the host, and walked back to my cabin while 50 people celebrated plans for land nobody had actually asked about. Saturday morning arrived with the strange quiet that comes after people convince themselves something is settled. No trucks. No chairs. No music. Just mountain air and the faint smell of coffee drifting through open windows somewhere down the ridge. I walked outside carrying Walter's envelope and sat on the deck. The overlook sign was still there. The string lights were still hanging. Somebody had left 2 folding chairs pointed directly at the valley like the view had already changed ownership. I stayed there for a while and watched sunlight move across the trees. Then I opened the folder again. Not the closing documents this time. The digital archive the title company had sent me after closing. Hundreds of pages. Survey maps. Transfer records. Easement agreements. Amendments. Most people never read those. Most people assume if everybody acts confident, somebody already checked. Around page 112, I found something odd. Ridgeview Community Association. Ground lease summary. That caught my attention because communities usually talk about ownership, not leases. I opened it. 40 years old. Original developer agreement. Legal language dense enough to cure insomnia. I started reading. Then I read it again. Then one more time slower. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, the only sound was pages turning. Around noon my phone rang. Unknown number again. Melissa from the HOA office. Her voice sounded more relaxed than before. "Hi, Mr. Caldwell. Just following up. Rebecca wanted to know when she can expect your signed participation forms." I looked at the document in front of me. "Question for you." Small pause. "Sure." I kept my voice casual. "Who owns the common areas?" Silence. Not long. Just enough. Then she answered quickly. "The association manages them." Not what I asked. I smiled. That was not my question. Another pause. Papers moving in the background. Keyboard clicks. Then she laughed lightly. "Honestly, I do not know. Nobody has ever asked." I thanked her and hung up. I looked back at the lease summary. Ground rights. Annual obligations. Development restrictions. Transfer provisions. Then a section title stopped me cold. Successor landholder authority. I leaned closer. Read every word twice. No dramatic music. No glowing revelation. Just ordinary legal language hiding in plain sight. The original developer had never sold the land beneath Ridgeview. He had sold occupancy rights, improvement rights, and community administration rights. Ownership of the underlying land remained with a holding company and transferred privately every generation. My eyes moved down the page. Current transfer executed 6 weeks ago. New landholder designation attached under acquisition package. I already knew what document it referred to before I opened it. My closing packet. Same file number. Same date. Same signature block. I sat back slowly. Outside, somebody laughed in the distance. Somewhere down the hill a golf cart passed. Life continuing normally. Nobody panicking. Nobody hiding. Because why would they? If nobody reads the last page, reality belongs to whoever talks first. I looked at Walter's note again. Wait until they tell you what they own. Then I looked through the window at the overlook sign planted in my yard and realized something that made me laugh out loud for the first time since moving in. Rebecca had never actually claimed my land. She thought she already had it. Monday morning, I did not call a lawyer. I did not print documents. I did not march into the HOA office holding a folder like some courtroom movie. That is what people expect when they discover they have leverage. They rush. Walter had clearly spent years learning the opposite. The smell of rain drifted through the cracked kitchen window while low clouds rolled across the ridge. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started reading everything. Covenants, meeting notes, archived newsletters, annual budgets. If Ridgeview had operated for 20 years assuming authority, I wanted to know exactly how. By noon I had a legal pad full of notes and one growing realization. Nobody was hiding anything. That was the strange part. Their paperwork was all there. Public. Organized. Clean. It just kept using words that sounded stronger than they actually were. Controlled. Managed. Administered. Maintained. Never owned. Around 2 in the afternoon, another email arrived. Subject line. Final notice before compliance review. Rebecca had escalated. Formal tone now. The message explained that continued refusal to acknowledge community procedures could result in temporary suspension of access privileges and project continuation without my participation. Attached was a schedule. Construction resumed Wednesday. Phase 2. Permanent installation. I opened the attachment. Observation deck expansion. Utility routing. Landscape adjustment. Then one line made me stop. Estimated land usage approval. Confirmed. I smiled. Confirmed by who? I closed the laptop and walked outside. Cool air. Wet cedar. Somebody had already replaced the temporary overlook sign with a larger painted one. The confidence was impressive. I followed the gravel road down to the community office for the first time. Small building. Stone facade. American flag. Flower beds too symmetrical to be accidental. Inside smelled like printer toner and vanilla candles. Melissa sat behind the front desk. Mid-30s. Friendly. Efficient. She smiled when she saw me. Mr. Caldwell. Can I help? I smiled back. Actually, yes. I had a question. She looked relieved. Like maybe I had finally accepted community life. Sure. I looked around casually. Framed HOA history photos. Community awards. A giant wall map. Then I asked, who pays the annual ground obligation? Her smile disappeared so softly most people would miss it. Sorry. I repeated it exactly. The annual ground obligation. Who handles that? Her eyes moved once toward a door in the back office. Tiny movement. Then back to me. I think accounting. I nodded. Interesting. She hesitated. Why? I smiled. No reason. Just trying to understand how things work around here. Same words Rebecca used. Melissa laughed awkwardly and excused herself. She disappeared into the back for almost 2 minutes. When she returned, she handed me a brochure instead of answering. Community values. Local trails. Event calendar. No mention of land. I thanked her and left. As I stepped outside, I noticed something mounted beside the office entrance. Bronze plaque. Installed 21 years ago. Dedicated to the Ridgeview Community Association for Excellence in Stewardship under the Bishop Land Trust. I stopped walking. Read it again. Stewardship, not ownership. Then I looked back through the office window and realized something that made my coffee taste different all afternoon. Rebecca might not know, but somebody in that office definitely did. Wednesday morning arrived with perfect weather for making expensive mistakes. Clear sky, cold air, sunlight cutting through the pines in long, clean lines. I opened the cabin door and immediately heard engines. Not heavy equipment. Smaller this time. Utility carts. People talking. Construction had resumed. Phase 2. I stood on the deck with coffee and watched workers unload lumber near the overlook area. Somebody had started outlining the observation platform with white paint directly across the slope below my porch. The painted lines looked official, permanent, confident. I went back inside and opened my laptop one more time. Not because I doubted what I found, because timing matters. Everybody thinks power is about knowing something first. Most of the time it is about deciding when to stop letting people be wrong. Around 10 my phone rang. Rebecca. First time directly. I answered. Her voice sounded unusually warm. Ethan, we are doing final site review before permanent installation. You should come down. I said I would. 10 minutes later, I walked downhill. The air smelled like cut wood and fresh coffee. About 20 residents stood near the overlook, folding tables again. Somebody had printed concept images. Rebecca stood in the middle with a clipboard and sunglasses like she was unveiling a civic monument. She greeted me with a smile that looked practiced enough to survive bad news. Perfect, she turned to everyone. Before we begin, one final acknowledgement so there is no confusion later. She handed me a packet, thicker this time. Signature tabs, multiple pages. I flipped through them slowly. Temporary land accommodation, community access confirmation, long-term usage understanding. Same trick, more polished. Rebecca smiled. This simply formalizes what has already been agreed. I looked at her. Already agreed by who? Her expression did not move. The community. I nodded once. And who owns the land involved? A few people glanced at each other. Rebecca answered immediately. Too immediately. The association manages all shared areas. I smiled. That was not my question. Tiny pause. Then she laughed softly. We have operated this way for decades. I nodded again. Interesting answer. She folded her arms. If there is an issue, this is the time. People watched. Nobody looked hostile. Just uncomfortable. Like somebody had changed the script. I looked around at the chairs, the signs, the painted boundaries. Then I asked one more question. Calm voice. Same tone I had used all week. Who pays the annual ground obligation? Silence. Real silence this time. Rebecca blinked once. Somebody in the back frowned. One older resident said quietly, the what? Rebecca recovered fast. That is administrative. I nodded. Who pays it? No answer. Melissa was standing near the refreshment table. She looked down immediately. Rebecca smiled again, but it was different now. Smaller. Controlled. Why does that matter? I looked at the overlook sign. Then back at her. Because usually people know whether they own something before they build on it. Nobody spoke. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere down the road a golf cart passed. Rebecca stared at me for 2 seconds too long and finally said, What exactly are you implying? I smiled and handed the unsigned packet back. Nothing yet. Rebecca stared at me for another second and then smiled again. Professional recovery. I almost respected it. She turned to the crowd and laughed lightly. Well, apparently we have a lawyer in the neighborhood. A few people laughed with her. Not mean laughter. Relief laughter. The kind people use when they think tension just got explained away. She looked back at me. Look, if there is some paperwork question, we can sort it out later. But today is about moving forward. Then she reached toward the construction crew and gave a small nod. One of them started lifting equipment again. That was the moment. Not because she challenged me. Because she kept moving. Walter had been right. Wait until they tell you what they own. She had done it. Publicly. Repeatedly. I took a breath and reached into my jacket. No dramatic folder. No giant reveal. Just one sheet folded in thirds. I handed it to her. She took it automatically. Her eyes scanned the page. I watched her expression. Change in stages. First confidence. Then confusion. Then concentration. Then stillness. She read the header again. Ground lease successor assignment. Her eyes moved lower. Then lower. The mountain breeze lifted one corner of the paper. Nobody spoke. One resident finally asked, Rebecca? She looked up slowly. Where did you get this? I smiled. Closing packet. She looked back down. Somebody else stepped closer. The older man from the welcome event adjusted his glasses and read over her shoulder. His eyebrows climbed immediately. Wait. Another resident leaned in. Melissa had gone completely still near the refreshment table. Rebecca flipped the page over. Check the bottom. Check the attached record number. Then she looked at me again. This cannot be right. I nodded once. That is what I thought too. Nobody moved. Wind in the trees. String lights clicking softly overhead. Finally, the older man looked at Rebecca and asked the question nobody had apparently asked in years. Rebecca, do we lease this place? Silence. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it, opened the document again. I spoke calmly. Same tone I had used all week. The community manages operations. Residents own their homes. But the underlying land remains under the trust structure. I looked around at everyone. Transferred 6 weeks ago. Nobody looked angry. They looked surprised. Like finding out your favorite restaurant rents the building. One woman blinked twice and said, "So, who owns it?" I looked at Rebecca first, then at the